The saloon doors slammed against the walls as I stepped inside, and every glass, bottle, and mug in the room seemed to pause midair, frozen by the sight of me. I didn't even get my second boot off the threshold before the laughter started. Deep, hacking, alien laughter that rattled the rafters like a dust storm through dead trees. One voice, louder than the rest, called out, "Looky here, boys! A real live museum exhibit!" Another howled, "Careful now, don't spook the poor thing, might break a hip!" Their laughter was a weapon, sharpened by cruelty and oiled by too much bad whiskey, and in that instant, I realized two things. First, Dead Star Gulch wasn't just lawless. It was a place where a human was considered prey. Second, they had no idea what they just invited into their nest. I didn't flinch. I didn't frown. I didn't even tip my hat. I just walked, slow and steady, through the field of stairs, across a floor sticky with spilled liquor and other things I didn't want to name. The bars stretched long and battered along the right side, sagging under the weight of bottles filled with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Behind it, the bartender, an old leathery man with one glass eye and one real one, watched me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. He polished a glass that was already cleaner than anything else for 50 miles, his hands moving slow and deliberate. As I approached, he leaned in, voice low enough that only I could hear. "You're either real brave or real stupid, friend," he said. "Dead Star don't take kindly to soft skins." Before I could answer, a heavy boot thudded against the floor behind me. I turned half an inch, just enough to catch a glimpse without giving them the satisfaction of a full turn. 6 of them. Sidebacks. 7 feet tall, shoulders like tree trunks, skin scaled and shimmered in shades of dark green and bone white. Their leader, a nasty piece of work named Max Varro, shoved through his pack and swaggered toward me. His jaw was split by a jagged scar that gleamed when he smiled. He reached into his belt and pulled out something that clattered when it hit the floor, an ancient earth revolver, battered and pitted with rust. He kicked it toward me with one clawed foot. It spun across the floor and bumped into the toe of my boot. The entire saloon roared with laughter again, harsher now, fueled by the thrill of pending violence. Mox spread his arms wide, chest puffed out. "There you go, relic!" he bellowed. "Fight back if you can. Show us how you monkeys did it before the real folk came along." The gun at my feet was a joke. It might fire, or it might blow my hand clean off. Either way, it was an invitation. An insult. A dare. Around the room, I saw hands drift toward holsters, claws flex, fingers twitch. They didn't want a fight. They wanted a show. Something to laugh about when they retold the story over drinks. Poor human. Should have stayed on his dirtball planet. I stared down at the revolver for a long moment. The wood handle was cracked, and one chamber had a visible dent. Then I looked up at Max Varro and smiled. A slow, easy smile that made the laughter falter just a little. Without bending down, without saying a word, I pushed the revolver back toward him with the tip of my boot. It spun once, twice, and landed neatly between his feet. A ripple of confusion moved through the saloon like a cold wind. Mox's smile twisted. He didn't like that. Bullies never do when the victim doesn't play along. He took one heavy step toward me, but before he could open his mouth again, I spoke for the first time since entering Dead Star Gulch. "Give me a minute," I said, my voice carrying clean and clear through the heavy air. "I'll fetch something real to show you." The silence was thick enough to chew. Even the old tinny piano stopped playing in the corner. I turned on my heel and walked back toward the doors, letting the tension stretch behind me like a rope strung too tight. Every step I took away from that pistol, away from the challenge, was another laugh they thought they had earned. I could feel their smugness rising like heat off the desert floor. Some even clapped mockingly, slow, sarcastic applause that echoed off the cracked beams above. As I reached the doors, I glanced sideways at the bartender. His glass eye didn't move, but his real one did, locking onto me with a strange flicker of hope, or maybe just the thrill of a story about to unfold. He gave the tiniest nod. A man who knew what it meant when somebody wasn't afraid of dying. Outside, the sun was a low burning coin in a dirty orange sky. My cart sat hitched to an old six-legged draft beast, a massive creature that huffed and twitched its bristly ears as I approached. From under a heavy tarp, I pulled a canvas-wrapped bulk. It clanked when it shifted. Metal, old and heavy and alive with the promise of chaos. I could almost hear its heartbeat through the layers of cloth. A shadow crossed the dust near me. I turned just enough to see her, a slim figure leaning against a support post, arms folded. The bartender's daughter, I guessed. She had the same weather-worn skin and the same don't mess with me stare. Her eyes flicked from the bundle to me and back again. She didn't say a word. Just watched. I dropped the tailgate of the cart and heaved the bundle down, setting it upright. Then I unwrapped it carefully, like peeling a gift nobody wanted to receive. The Gatling gun stood there, squat and ugly and beautiful all at once. 6 barrels, heavy cranking mechanism, tripod legs braced wide. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't fast by today's standards. But it didn't have to be. It only had to be loud. It only had to be terrifying. I checked the ammunition belt, spun the crank once, felt the smooth resistance of gears older than some civilizations out here. The gun whispered a promise in every click of its metal teeth. From inside the saloon, I heard the laughter rising again, louder, meaner. They thought I'd run. They thought they'd won. I smiled, not because I was angry, but because I was about to teach Dead Star Gulch a lesson it would never forget. Slowly, I gripped the Gatling's crank, felt the old iron hum under my fingertips, and pushed it toward the saloon doors. Inside, they were still laughing when I crossed the threshold. They weren't laughing when the barrels started to spin. The saloon fell into a stunned hush the second they saw what I was dragging behind me. The heavy iron feet of the Gatling gun clanked over the warped wooden floorboards, each step loud enough to drown out the last echoes of laughter. The barrels spun lazily under my hand, not firing, not yet, just spinning, making a soft metallic whir that seemed to gnaw at the nerves of everyone inside. Max Vero's grin faltered, his thick fingers twitching near the butt of his slug thrower. I could see the thoughts crossing his reptilian face, the calculations, the sudden awareness that whatever game he thought he was playing had just changed. Around him, the other sidebacks shifted uneasily, eyes darting from the gun to me and back again. One bumped the table with his hip hard enough to topple a bottle, sending a green liquid spilling across the floor where it hissed and sizzled like acid. I planted the Gatling down dead center between the bar and the poker tables and cranked it just enough to send another ominous hum through the air. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The bartender's daughter, still leaning in the shadow near the doors, covered her mouth with one hand to hide a grin. She wasn't scared. She was entertained. She understood. Sometimes you don't have to start the fight to win it. Sometimes all you have to do is show up properly prepared. Max Varro tried to gather what was left of his bravado, puffing his chest out and barking at his men. Just an old relic. He's bluffin', boys. Human toys don't scare sidebacks. His words bounced off the walls, but his men didn't look so convinced. The bartender was edging back behind the bar now, quietly pushing all the bottles and glassware to the floor behind him like a man expecting an earthquake. 2 of the younger sidebacks, eager to prove themselves, stomped forward, their spiked boots rattling the floorboards. One was a bulky brute with a pair of rusted steel pauldrons welded to his shoulders. The other carried a curved blade that pulsed faintly with electric current. They didn't even draw their weapons at first. They thought they'd just shove me aside, take the gun, end this nonsense before it really got rolling. I stood behind the Gatling, one hand on the crank, the other lazily resting on the ammunition feed. I didn't say a word. I didn't raise my voice or warn them. I just watched. They were about 10 feet away when the first one roared and lunged, a wide, showy leap designed to intimidate. His friend stayed close behind, grinning wide with serrated teeth. In their minds, this was already over. In mine, it was just getting started. I twisted the crank once, not enough to fire but enough to make the barrels scream a little louder. The brute hit the ground 2 feet from me and skidded to a halt, eyes wide, as the realization finally clawed its way through his thick skull. The second sideback wasn't as quick to catch on. He swung his electrified blade in a wide arc aimed at the Gatling's legs. Before the blade could connect, I slapped the crank hard, and the gun answered with a roar. A burst of rounds tore into the floor between us, kicking up a splintered storm of wood and dust. The blade flew from the sideback's hands as he stumbled back, arms pinwheeling, before falling flat on his tail with a crash that shook the room. The saloon erupted into chaos. Chairs overturned, bottles shattered, and the piano player, who had been pretending not to watch, dove behind his instrument with a yelp. Some of the more sober patrons bolted for the doors, diving through windows if necessary, while others ducked behind tables and overturned barrels. In the middle of it all, Max Varro stood frozen, his pride fighting a losing battle against the survival instinct screaming in his brain. I let the Gatling spin down again, the barrels whining mournfully as they slowed. Smoke curled up from the muzzle and the air smelled of hot metal and scorched wood. I could have pressed the attack right then, could have painted the saloon walls with sideback blood. But I didn't. I wasn't here to slaughter them. I was here to teach them. I wanted every alien in that room to remember this moment for the rest of their unnatural lives. Mox growled low in his throat, a deep rumbling sound that might have been impressive if he weren't visibly shaking. He took a cautious step forward, hands raised slightly as if approaching a wild animal. Now, no need for all that, he said, voice oily with false calm. You made your point, human. Big scary gun. Hoo boy, we're all real impressed. I tilted my head slightly, keeping one hand near the crank. Maybe, Mox continued, trying for a smile. We just call it even, yeah? You walk out of here, we don't chase you down and skin you alive for making a mess. Behind him, his gang shifted uncomfortably. They didn't like the idea of even. Sidebacks didn't do even. They dominated or they got out of the way. I could see it in their eyes. Half of them wanted to rush me and hope they could swarm me before the gun shredded them. The other half wanted to slink out the back door and pretend this never happened. Before Mox could bluster any further, I cranked the Gatling half a turn. The whirring growl shut him right up. Not here to bargain, I said quietly. Not here to beg. Just came in for a drink. Then you threw that piece of junk at my feet. Mox glanced at the revolver still lying sadly on the floor between us, as if realizing for the first time how badly he'd misplayed his hand. The bartender's daughter spoke up then, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'd pour him the best whiskey you got, Pa. And maybe clean up a bit around here. Looks like Dead Star's got a new sheriff. The saloon froze again, not out of fear this time, but from the weight of those words settling into the bones of every man, woman, and creature in the room. A few of the braver souls peered up from behind their cover, eyes wide with something new, hope. Mox snorted, tried for a sneer, but it came out weak and broken. He bent, scooped up the revolver, and threw it into the nearest barrel of slop with a splash. Then, without another word, he turned and stomped toward the exit, his gang trailing behind him like a line of beaten dogs. The doors swung shut behind them with a mournful creak. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension bleed out of me, and finally approached the bar. The bartender, hand trembling, poured a double shot of something amber and smoky into a glass and slid it my way. On the house, he rasped. I took it with a nod, raised it slightly toward the bartender's daughter, who grinned back at me, and knocked it back in one smooth gulp. The liquid burned all the way down, but it was a good burn. A righteous burn. The Gatling gun sat there beside me, quiet now but still hungry. Dead Star Gulch had changed the second I walked through that door, and everyone inside knew it. The news of what had happened in the saloon traveled faster than a prairie fire in dry season. By the time the sun finished sliding down behind the jagged cliffs outside Dead Star Gulch, half the town had heard some version of the story. Some said I'd dragged a cursed death machine into the saloon and dared the sidebacks to blink. Others whispered that I wasn't a man at all, but some old Earth War spirit brought back in flesh and smoke. One thing stayed the same across every retelling though. Dead Star Gulch had a new power sitting behind the bar, and it wasn't the sidebacks anymore. For the first time in years, the lawless had found something they feared even more than each other. It wasn't because of how many rounds I fired. It was because of how few. I spent most of that evening seated at the bar, Gatling gun parked beside me like a faithful hound. The bartender, still a little rattled but warming up to me fast, slid another drink across without being asked. His daughter leaned against the far wall, arms folded, watching the door like she half expected trouble to come crashing through at any second. I didn't talk much. I didn't have to. Every few minutes, one of the braver locals would sidle up close, nod respectfully, murmur something about buying me a drink later, and scurry off again before my shadow could catch up to them. The tension that had once made Dead Star Gulch dangerous was still thick in the air, but now it was twisted into something new. Caution. Respect. A little bit of fear. It didn't take long for the sidebacks to test the limits. They never could let a slight go unpunished, especially not when their pride was involved. About an hour after sunset, the saloon doors creaked open and a hush fell across the room so fast you could hear the flies buzzing in the rafters. 2 figures stepped inside, both wrapped in dusty cloaks, faces hidden. Their steps were too light, too cautious, not the heavy stomp of your usual outlaw trash. Assassins. Probably hired from some off-world bounty guild, the kind that like clean kills and big paydays. They paused just inside, scanning the room, looking for me. I didn't move. I didn't even look their way. I just let my fingers drift lazily along the crank of the Gatling gun, slow enough to be casual, deliberate enough to be a warning. They hesitated, clearly not expecting to find me so out in the open, so unconcerned. One of them shifted slightly, hand dipping under the cloak toward whatever weapon he was hiding. The bartender's daughter caught my eye and gave the tiniest nod, confirming what I already knew. They weren't here to talk. The first assassin moved, a flash of silver whipping from under the cloak. The throwing blade spun toward me faster than most eyes could follow, aimed dead center at my heart. In a single motion, I leaned sideways off my stool, slapped the crank forward, and let the Gatling answer for me. The barrel spun and the room filled with a roar like a thunderstorm breaking inside 4 walls. The blade never reached me. It shattered midair, chewed into dust by a storm of bullets that ripped across the space between us. The assassins dove for cover, but they didn't make it. I didn't aim to kill them outright, just taught them the same lesson the sidebacks had learned earlier. The floor exploded in splinters under their feet, tables shredded, and bottles burst into rainbow sprays of liquor. One of them lost his nerve and sprinted for the door, cloak flapping wildly. He never looked back. The other tried to crawl behind the overturned piano, only to find a bullet chewing the wood inches from his head. I spun the crank once more, then let the barrels slow to silence. Smoke curled upward, catching the lamplight in lazy tendrils. The saloon was a wreck again, but nobody cared. In fact, for the first time all night, I heard real laughter, not mocking, not cruel. Genuine laughter, rising from the corners of the room like fresh spring rain after a drought. The bartender chuckled as he pulled out a fresh bottle from under the counter, setting it next to my glass without a word. His daughter whistled low and shook her head, a grin stretching across her face. She wandered over, tilting her head toward the ruined piano where the second assassin was still trying to hide. "You want me to kick him out, Marshal?" she asked, voice light but dangerous. The word caught me by surprise. Marshal. It settled into the air like a brand iron against hide, sizzling its way into the collective memory of Dead Star Gulch. I hadn't claimed the title. I hadn't even asked for it. But here it was, offered freely, with all the weight and expectation it carried. I shrugged. "Tell him to crawl out. Tell him to run. Tell him if he ever comes back, I'll stop aiming wide." She grinned wider, sauntered over, and delivered the message with a sharp boot to the ribs and a few colorful threats. The would-be killer needed no further encouragement. He bolted through the door after his partner, stumbling over himself in the process. The saloon doors flapped shut behind them, and just like that, Dead Star Gulch breathed easier. I turned back to the bar, drained my glass, and nodded to the bartender, who gave me a small, grateful salute in return. It wasn't formal. It wasn't ceremonial. It didn't need to be. Sometimes, in places like this, Respect was the only currency that mattered. The rest of the night passed in a strange, peaceful kind of silence. No more threats. No more challengers. Just the soft murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the occasional glance toward the battered but still standing Gatling gun sitting proud beside me. As midnight crawled past and the moons rose high above the rust-colored cliffs, I found myself alone at the bar except for the bartender and his daughter. She leaned against the counter now, fiddling with a deck of cards she'd found somewhere. "You're not what I expected," she said after a long while. "Nobody ever is," I answered. She smiled at that, a real one, full of sharp edges and genuine amusement. "You think they'll come back? The sidebacks?" I considered it. They might. Pride made men and monsters stupid. But Dead Star Gulch wasn't the same place anymore. The scales had tipped, and not in their favor. "If they do," I said, "they'll think twice before stepping through those doors." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to shuffling her cards. I stayed a little longer, watching the flames dance low in the hearth, listening to the creak of the saloon settling into its new life. Tomorrow, maybe more trouble would come. Maybe the sidebacks would rally, bring more guns, more muscle. Maybe other gangs would hear about a human taking over Dead Star Gulch and come sniffing for weakness. It didn't matter. I had old Betsy at my side and the town behind me now. Let them come. Dead Star had found its marshal, and I wasn't going anywhere. The morning after the saloon standoff was different from any other morning Dead Star Gulch had seen in years. The air itself felt sharper, like the town had been scrubbed clean by the smoke and gunpowder of the night before. People walked the streets differently now, not hunched over and darting their eyes at every shadow, but upright, talking to one another, tipping hats, and offering real smiles. A few even nodded at me as I made my way down the creaking steps of the saloon's porch, old Betsy perched on a heavy wooden cart behind me like a throne. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't fear. It was something better. It was respect. I was cranking the mechanism, cleaning and oiling her gears under the early sun, when I heard the low, deliberate stomp of heavy boots approaching. Sheriff Kavix, the mechanical titan that passed for law around these parts before he decided to retire without retiring, was walking straight toward me, his iron-plated legs clanking with every step. He was part sheriff, part machine, part reminder of a time when Dead Star had tried to be something better. Most of the town thought he'd rusted into harmlessness. I hadn't been so sure. Kavik stopped a few paces away, his optical sensors whirring quietly as they adjusted to the morning glare. His voice, when it came, was a grinding rasp that seemed to chew the words before spitting them out. "Heard you made quite the noise yesterday," he said. I didn't look up from my work. Noise was necessary. A long pause stretched between us, filled only by the clicking of old Betsy's spinning barrels. When I finally looked up, Kavix was holding something out toward me. A badge. Worn, scratched, but still recognizable under the dust. The star emblem of a Dead Star Marshal. "You want to keep order," Kavix said. "Best you wear this. Makes it official." I stared at it for a moment. 100 reasons not to take it ran through my mind. Authority brought attention. Attention brought trouble. I hadn't come here to lead anything. I had come to pass through, maybe settle a score or two, and move along. But looking down Main Street, at the faces now peering out from behind doors and windows, I realized something had changed the moment I'd fired the Gatling inside that saloon. I hadn't just scared the sidebacks. I had given the people a glimpse of something they had forgotten they deserved. Safety. I wiped my hands on a rag, stood, and took the badge. The town seemed to breathe a little easier when I pinned it to my chest. Kavix nodded once, a slow, mechanical jerk of approval, then turned and stomped away without another word. It wasn't about thanks or promises. It was about the work. Always the work. The first real test of my new position came quicker than I would have liked. Mox Varro wasn't a creature who knew how to take humiliation quietly. Word came by noon, delivered by a breathless farmhand, that the sidebacks had holed up at the old freight yard outside town, gathering what remained of their gang along with some hired guns who didn't care about anything but credits and blood. "They're planning a ride into town," the farmhand gasped. "Full charge. Shoot up everything. Take back what's theirs." I finished buckling the last strap on old Betsy's mounting rig and nodded. "Let them come." By sundown, we were ready. It wasn't just me standing there behind the barricades we threw up at the edge of town. It was the bartender, cradling an ancient plasma shotgun that hadn't seen use in decades. It was his daughter, her hair tied back, a coil gun slung over her shoulder. It was ranchers, miners, store clerks, and drifters who decided that Dead Star Gulch was worth fighting for. We didn't have numbers. We didn't have fancy tech. We had grit. We had old Betsy. And we had a cause the sidebacks couldn't understand. The first hint of their arrival was the low, drumming thunder of hooves and steel wheels grinding against dirt. Lights bobbed in the growing dusk, electric lanterns strapped to battered war bikes and jury-rigged assault wagons. They came like a storm, howling and hooting, weapons waving in the air. I let them come closer than they probably should have. Close enough to see Max Vero's snarling face leading the charge. Close enough for the hired guns to start raising their rifles. Then I cranked the handle. Old Betsy sang. The first line of riders disintegrated into chaos. Wheels snapped. Riders pitched forward. Beasts shrieked and bolted. The Gatling didn't discriminate. It tore through armor, bone, and pride alike. The townsfolk opened up with everything they had. Shotguns roared. Coilguns snapped. Slingshots hurled iron pellets with deadly accuracy. The sidebacks, used to winning through sheer terror and brute force, didn't know how to handle organized resistance. They faltered, stumbled, and within moments the charge turned into a retreat. I didn't let up. I kept cranking until the barrels of old Betsy glowed faintly red and smoke poured off her in thick, angry plumes. I didn't aim to kill them all. Just to break them so thoroughly that Dead Star Gulch would never have to fear them again. When the last of them fled into the night, leaving behind wreckage, wounded pride, and the smell of burning oil, I let go of the crank and stepped back. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear. From the power. The right kind of power. The townsfolk slowly lowered their weapons. A few cheered, hesitant at first, then louder. Someone started pounding the butt of a shotgun against the dirt in rhythm. Others joined in. Within minutes, the whole town square vibrated with the sound of fists and rifle stocks hitting the earth, a thunderous, raw song of victory. The bartender clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to nearly knock me over. His daughter grinned fiercely, her face smeared with dust and sweat, eyes shining. "You're staying right?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. I looked around at the battered but standing barricades, at the battered but smiling faces, at the trail of smoke still drifting up from old Betsy's overheated barrels. I thought about the road I had meant to take, the quiet life I had wanted far away from all of this. But Dead Star Gulch wasn't just a stopover anymore. It was mine now. And I was its marshal. The days that followed the Battle of Dead Star were unlike anything the town had ever seen. Where once fear kept the streets empty and the saloons grim, now laughter floated out of the doorways. Merchants opened their shops early and kept them open late. Kids who used to sneak through alleys now played in the open, chasing each other between the wagons and the water troughs without a second thought. Folks still eyed the horizon from time to time, still kept rifles handy behind doors and counters, but it wasn't the desperate, fearful clutch of a hunted animal. It was the steady readiness of people who had remembered they had a right to defend what was theirs. Every so often, travelers and drifters would roll into town, and when they did, their eyes would catch on the iron monster mounted just inside the saloon's front door. Old Betsy, polished clean now, standing silent sentinel like some grim patron saint of Dead Star Gulch. They would take one look at her, then at the townsfolk walking around with their heads high, and they would understand. Dead Star wasn't a place to trifle with anymore. Rumors about the town began to spread out beyond the dusty canyons and broken highways, carried by frightened mercenaries and wide-eyed traders. They said Dead Star was guarded by a madman with an ancient death machine. They said he was faster than thought, immune to fear, maybe not even human at all. Some said he was a ghost of Earth's old wars, risen to bring justice to the lawless planets. The stories grew wilder the further they traveled, until even the hardened gangs on neighboring moons thought twice about steering too close. For the first time in living memory, Dead Star Gulch became a dead zone on the outlaw maps, a place marked not with opportunity, but with warning signs. I didn't ask for the reputation, but I didn't fight it either. A reputation could be as good as an army if you knew how to wield it. Better sometimes. I kept the badge pinned to my chest, but I didn't turn into the kind of lawman who threw his weight around. Folks here didn't need another bully. They needed someone to make sure the fires stayed out and the blood stayed off the dirt. So I spent my days riding the edges of town, fixing broken fences, helping patch up the freight yard, teaching kids how to shoot straight and treat a jammed rifle with respect. I spent my nights sitting on the porch of the saloon, old Betsy by my side, a cup of black coffee or a bottle of cheap whiskey in hand, watching the stars crawl across the sky. Every once in a while, someone foolish would roll into town thinking they could make a name for themselves by gunning down the marshal. Those moments never lasted long. I didn't even have to fire old Betsy most times. A slow turn of the crank, a lazy whir of the barrels, and the challenger would usually find sudden business in another town far, far away. The few who didn't get the hint ended up limping out of Dead Star missing more pride than blood. Nobody had died since that first night, and I intended to keep it that way if I could. One evening, just as the sun was dying in a blaze of gold and red behind the cliffs, the bartender's daughter came and sat beside me on the porch. She kicked her boots up on the rail, cradling a battered harmonica in her hands. She'd taken to calling herself Sal now, said it sounded sharper, tougher, the kind of name people remembered. She'd taken to watching the town almost as much as I did, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You know," she said, turning the harmonica over in her hands, "you could leave any time you wanted. Town's strong enough now. They could keep going without you." I didn't answer right away. I sipped my coffee, feeling the bitter warmth settle deep in my chest. The sky was full of stars now, endless and clean, the kind of sky you only get in places too wild for proper civilization. "Could," I said finally. "But some things are worth staying for." Sal grinned and blew a lazy note on the harmonica. It wavered and cracked and wasn't particularly good, but it was real. Like everything else in Dead Star Gulch these days. That night, as the town settled into the deep, easy quiet of safety, I thought about what staying really meant. It meant more fights, sure. Trouble always found its way to people who dared to build something worth protecting. It meant more long nights, more hard days, maybe even some hard losses. But it also meant belonging somewhere again. It meant standing for something that mattered, not because someone paid you to, but because it was right. A few days later, a delegation rode in from the neighboring town of Black Hollow. They weren't armed to the teeth like most travelers. They came riding plain wagons, hands open, eyes wide with curiosity and respect. Their mayor, a stout little man who looked like he spent more time in a kitchen than on a horse, stepped forward and offered me a handshake. "We heard what you did here," he said. "We want to know if you'll teach us. Help us set up the same thing back home." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an offer of money or power. It was something rarer. It was trust. I thought about it for a long moment. Then I shook his hand. "I'll help you," I said. "But you're gonna need something better than guns." He frowned a little, confused. I tapped the side of my head lightly. "Better have some backbone too," I added. "This town didn't change because of old Betsy. She just reminded folks what they already had inside them." We spent the next few weeks training folks from Black Hollow. Sal helped. Even Kavix, creaking and sputtering like an old engine, got involved. Dead Star Gulch became something like a school for a while, a place where people came to remember how to stand tall. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But it was real. And through it all, old Betsy sat on her platform, barrels polished to a dull gleam, a monument to the moment a beaten town remembered who they were. On quiet nights, when the work was done and the world stretched silent around us, I would sit on the porch, sip my coffee, and listen to Sal's harmonica drift on the wind. Sometimes it was rough. Sometimes it was sweet. But it was always alive, and it always made me smile. Dead Star Gulch wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was strong. It was free. It was home. And I aimed to keep it that way, crank by crank, day by day, for as long as the stars hung in the sky.